Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're heading back to 1946 Chicago. Picture a city on edge, fear in every shadow. The reason. A string of brutal murders that terrified the city.
And at the center of it all, William Heirens, better known as the lipstick killer.
Convicted and currently serving 3 life sentences.
Mm.
But even after all this time, doubts about his guilt still linger.
Right. The case is fascinating because there's this evidence and these arguments suggesting things might not be as clear-cut as they first seemed.
Exactly. And that's precisely why we're taking this deep dive. We're going to try to untangle this whole thing using 2 main sources excerpts from Murderpedia, which you might know as the online encyclopedia of murderers.
A great resource.
Yeah. And then we've got an in-depth analysis from crimelibrary.com. We're going way beyond the headlines with this one, examining the evidence, digging into those inconsistencies, and, maybe even uncovering some unsettling truths along the way.
Basically, we're putting on our detective hats today, trying to figure out what really happened.
Exactly. All right, let's rewind a bit. William Heirens, just 17 years old when they arrested him. But before those terrifying murders, his life was already a strange mix of, normal and troubling behavior.
Yeah, on the surface, pretty typical teenager, right? Heirens was into electronics, bright kid, good student.
Seems pretty normal so far.
But his home life, that's where things get a bit messy, lots of tension. His parents constantly arguing about money, especially during the Depression, which, understandable.
Definitely adds stress to any family.
And it seems Heirens found a way to cope with all that, but not in a healthy way. At just 13, he starts breaking into homes.
13. That's young to be a burglar.
And he wasn't just snatching some cash or easy to pawn stuff. This kid was daring, agile. We're talking scaling walls, navigating ledges, even shimmying up drain pipes to get into these places.
So like a teenage Spider-Man, basically.
Pretty much. I mean, it makes you wonder what was going on in his head. That's a pretty unusual way to deal with family stress.
No kidding. And then this whole pattern of burglary continues even as he's, excelling in school. He gets into the University of Chicago at 16. That's a great future right there.
You'd think so, but he just keeps going with these risky break-ins.
So it's like this double life. Good student by day, daring burglar by night. I think you wonder if there's any connection between those 2 sides of him.
Right, that's the big question, isn't it? This contradiction becomes even more chilling when you looked at the murders that shook Chicago, the ones that led to his arrest.
Right, the murders of Josephine Ross, Frances Brown, and then 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan. Each case just horrifying in its own way.
Josephine Ross found stabbed multiple times in her apartment. Brutal, personal. They didn't take anything valuable, but her head was wrapped in a dress.
That's a chilling detail.
Yeah, and then there's Frances Brown, also stabbed, and this is where that lipstick killer nickname comes from.
Right, because of the message written on the wall.
Exactly. The killer used Brown's own lipstick to write this message on the wall, begging to be caught. Sent shockwaves through the city. And importantly, there was a bloody fingerprint at the scene.
And then, of course, the case that really gripped the entire city, the kidnapping and murder of Suzanne Degnan.
Absolutely. A parent's worst nightmare.
A ransom note with misspellings. And then, tragically, they find parts of her body in sewers. The media went crazy, and the public was terrified.
You can imagine the pressure on the police. They had to solve these cases.
Must have been intense, and that kind of pressure sometimes leads to, well, let's just say questionable decisions, like what happened with Hector Verber.
Right. A janitor in the building where they found some of Suzanne's remains. He gets arrested, beaten by the police, wrongly accused just because he was there.
Wow. So this investigation, not exactly a shining example of good police work.
Unfortunately, no. False leads, mistakes. It felt like a panic situation. Makes you wonder if the need to find someone quickly overshadowed, actually doing a thorough and just investigation.
Then fate steps in, and Heirens gets caught during another burglary.
He was cornered, tried to run, but then a flower pot falls on his head, knocks him unconscious.
A flower pot. That's a pretty dramatic way to end a burglary career.
It is. But here's where things take a darker turn, the interrogation.
Right.
Heirens, still just 17, and they subject him to days of questioning, no sleep, even beatings, no food, no lawyer.
They used sodium pentothal on him too, didn't they? The so-called truth serum.
They did, and claimed he admitted to the murders under its influence. But we know now that sodium pentothal is unreliable. It doesn't force people to tell the truth.
More like lowers inhibitions, right?
Exactly, which can actually lead to false confessions.
So much for truth serum. Didn't they also claim Heirens talked about this alter ego, George Merman, while he was on the drug? It's a bizarre detail.
It is, and the media had a field day with that, portraying him as this dangerous split personality. But how much of what happened during those interrogations can we really trust?
That's the question, right? I mean, with all that pressure, the exhaustion, the drug, who knows what he was actually saying or meant?
Especially considering this was before Miranda rights. They didn't have the same protections back then.
Makes you wonder if the whole thing was coerced.
Definitely raises some serious ethical concerns. So let's look at the evidence they actually had. What connected him to those murders, besides that confession under questionable circumstances?
Right.
Well, the prosecution's case relied heavily on fingerprints. They claimed they found his on the Degnan ransom note and another one at Francis Brown's murder scene.
Fingerprints, everyone assumes those are like the gold standard, right?
You'd think so, but that's where our deep dive into the complexities of this case really gets interesting. Let's unpack some of the arguments for Heirens' innocence. Buckle up. Lots to unpack here, starting with that Degnan ransom note. So the police, they couldn't find any usable prints on it at first. Sent it off to the FBI lab.
Makes sense. FBI's got the fancy tech, right?
Exactly. They used this technique called iodine fuming, revealed 2 prints, but here's the thing. Prints developed this way, they fade fast. So they photographed them and sent the note and photos back to Chicago.
Okay, so FBI finds prints, takes pictures, sends everything back. What happens next?
This is where it gets interesting. Sergeant Laffey, the Chicago police fingerprint expert, initially said the prints were too incomplete to, classify. Think about that. The FBI just revealed these prints. But Laffey couldn't match them to anyone. Not even to Heirens, who they already had fingerprints from a previous arrest.
Wait, they'd arrested Heirens before the Degnan murder? What for?
Burglary a few months prior, but the charges were dropped. Here's the kicker. It's not until after they arrest Heirens for the murders that Laffey suddenly announces a 9-point match to Heirens' left little finger. And then, shortly after, a match for the second print on the note.
So they couldn't match the prints until Heirens was their main suspect. That timing, that's a little suspicious, don't you think?
Raises some eyebrows, for sure. And it gets even weirder. Months after the FBI sent that note back, Chicago PD announces that Laffey found a third print, a palm print on the back, also matching Heirens.
Hold on, 3 prints. I thought there were only 2 at first. And a palm print, that's not exactly small. How do you miss that?
Right, exactly. Plus, remember how they gave that reporter, Frank Sanhamel, the original ransom note? The one they were checking for, hidden indentation writing?
Yeah, not the best way to handle evidence.
Means that note was handled by who knows how many people outside the investigation. Potential contamination all over the place.
So we've got questionable timing, possible contamination, and a mysterious third print. This indisputable fingerprint evidence is starting to sound a lot more disputable.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to the fingerprint from the Francis Brown crime scene. Also controversial. So the print, they described it as this bloody smudge, found on the door jamb between the bathroom and dressing room in her apartment. Initially, the police said it didn't match Heirens, even cleared him as a suspect in her murder at first.
But then they changed their minds.
12 days later, they declared it a match to Heirens. Claimed there were 22 points of comparison. But during Heirens' sentencing, Laffey admitted there were only 8 points for the end joint and just 6 for the middle joint.
6 points. I thought the FBI standard for a positive match was 12.
You're absolutely right. And get this, the print on that door jamb, it looks like a rolled fingerprint, the kind you get from an ink pad, not a smudged bloody print.
Are you suggesting it could have been planted?
It's a possibility we can't ignore with all these inconsistencies. And let's not forget the handwriting evidence. More contradictions. Several handwriting experts initially said that Heirens' writing didn't match the ransom note or the lipstick message. Then a different expert claims he did write them, completely contradicting his earlier assessment.
Okay, so the fingerprints are shaky, the handwriting analysis is a mess, and the confession was obtained under, let's just say, less than ideal circumstances. It sounds like the prosecution's case is falling apart, but if Heirens didn't commit these murders, who did? Is there another suspect?
There's one person who's emerged as a particularly interesting alternative suspect, Richard Russell Thomas.
Richard Russell Thomas. All right, tell me more. Who was this guy, and why is he considered a possible suspect?
Richard Russell Thomas was a nurse. And not just any nurse, he had a history of violence and extortion. In fact, he actually confessed to the Degnan murder.
He confessed. Why wasn't he charged then?
Timing, unfortunately. He confessed just as Heirens was becoming the prime suspect. The police were so focused on Heirens that they basically dismissed Thomas's confession, even though there were some striking similarities between his past crimes and the Degnan case.
What kind of similarities are we talking about?
Well, for one, Thomas had a prior conviction for extortion, and the ransom note he used in that case, it resembles the Degnan ransom note, both the wording and the handwriting style.
So it's not just a confession out of nowhere. There's a pattern of this kind of behavior.
Exactly. And Thomas was definitely in Chicago when the Degnan murder happened, had a history of violence, including domestic abuse. Plus, he was known to steal surgical supplies.
Surgical supplies. Why is that important?
Remember how the police initially thought the Degnan killer had surgical knowledge because of how her body was, dismembered?
Right.
Well, Thomas had access to those kinds of supplies. Makes that detail even more creepy.
So a confession, a similar crime in his past, and access to surgical tools. It's starting to sound like Thomas could be a real possibility. Anything else connecting him to the murder?
There is. Parts of Suzanne Degnan's body were found in a sewer near a car agency. Turns out, Thomas was a regular visitor there.
A car agency he frequented. That's a pretty big coincidence, especially with everything else we've learned about him.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder if the police were so focused on Heirens that they missed a more obvious suspect.
So what happened to Richard Russell Thomas? Did they ever seriously investigate him for these murders?
Unfortunately not. He ended up serving time for that other crime and died in prison in 1974.
Okay.
And here's the thing. Most of the records from his interrogation about the Chicago murders, they vanished, disappeared, or been destroyed. So frustrating. Could have been valuable information about Thomas, and now it's gone. So what about William Heirens? After his conviction, did he just disappear into the system?
What's amazing is that Heirens, he didn't just give up. He completely transformed himself in prison, dedicated himself to education, became a model inmate,
Really?
even earned a college degree while he was incarcerated, first prisoner in Illinois history to do so.
Wow, that's incredible. Takes a lot of dedication to do that, especially in prison.
It does. It speaks to his character. He didn't let his circumstances define him, used his time to grow, learn, and even contribute to the prison community.
It sounds like he was trying to make the best of a bad situation. Did that have any impact on his chances of release?
It definitely became a central part of his argument for clemency. Heirens and his supporters pointed to his rehabilitation, his consistent good behavior, as evidence that he deserved a second chance.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Shows a willingness to take responsibility even while maintaining his innocence.
Wow.
Did those arguments work? Did the parole board ever consider releasing him?
They didn't, unfortunately. Despite all the efforts, multiple parole denials, the shadow of those murders, that lipstick killer label, just too much to overcome.
It's like even with evidence of his rehabilitation and doubts about his guilt, that nickname was just stuck to him.
Public perception can be powerful, even when it's based on, flawed information.
So did Heirens ever give up hope? After all those years in prison, it would be understandable.
He never did. Heirens kept exploring legal options, trying to challenge his conviction, gain clemency, had support from some big legal experts and activists who truly believed in his innocence.
That's impressive. Holding on to that hope for so long, it really makes you think.
His case became a focal point for those advocating for changes in the justice system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Highlighting the risks of wrongful convictions, the problems with eyewitness accounts, the dangers of pushing people too hard during interrogations, and the importance of thorough, unbiased investigations.
It's a story that's still relevant today, making us question how our justice system works and how we find the truth. We started this deep dive thinking we were looking at a classic true crime case, a confession, a killer behind bars. But now I'm left with more questions than answers. What do you think? After all the evidence, the inconsistencies, the twists and turns, could William Heirens have been wrongly convicted? Does the evidence point more towards Richard Russell Thomas? Or is there something else we're missing entirely?
Well, that's the thing with a case like this. It makes you question what you thought you knew, makes you face some uncomfortable truths. It really leaves you wondering about the very nature of justice.
It does.
This deep dive, it's giving you the facts, the different sides of the story, the mysteries that remain. Now it's your turn to weigh it all, think about the unanswered questions, and come to your own conclusions. We may never have a definitive answer, but exploring the truth in the William Heirens case, it's a journey worth taking.
I think you're right about that. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, everyone.